Welcome to another Spotify podcast. And I'm here with my co-host, Timo Shenko. Say hello, Timo.
Hello. Hey.
Hey. And I'm really excited about this episode this week because we are going to be talking about jazz acoustic bass. And
yes, finally.
And if there's anybody I know who knows a little bit about jazz acoustic bass, it's you, Timo.
Yeah, especially the traditional stuff, the older stuff.
Yeah.
It's one of my favorites.
Yeah, and as an upright jazz bass player yourself, you're not just a fan or study these guys for their music, but also their technique and how they approach this big, cumbersome instrument.
Yeah, and the tone and the time field that they're getting. That's really how they drive the band, you know?
Yeah, so I think we should get into a couple different things today. And one thing I thought we should talk about, well, let me do the housekeeping quickly first. You can find us on Spotify where you get the music, full cuts of the music integrated in with our podcast. And if you don't have a Spotify account, you can go over to YouTube and get the podcast there as well. We also have playlists on Spotify of just the songs. So if after you've listened to the show and you want to go back, you don't have to listen to the show. You can go right over to the playlists and just listen to all the great music without our inane commentary in between. And we also have a Patreon page. We're starting to pick up some subscribers to that, which is great. And there you get exclusive content. And also if you are studying the music, you can get a lot of Timo's transcriptions that he's written himself about a lot of the music that we talk about, and also private Zoom lessons to talk about music theory, composition, and also explore all aspects of music. So check that out too. And now we'll get back to the show. So one of the things I wanted to talk about, because I know that we throw out some of these music terms at times, and to a person who doesn't study music, they maybe don't know what we're talking about. And I think one thing that would be great to just kind of give a little lesson, especially before we talk about bass, is the kind of number system when we talk about 4 chords or 5 chords or the third degree of the scale. Just give the super basic thing about, what's a fourth, what's a fifth, what's a ninth when you're saying it's a sharp 13. Can you just kind of...
You never call it a sharp 13. You only call that a flat 7 now.
Okay, yeah. A flat 7. Yeah. Okay, I'm already confused. No, but if you could just...
It's a lot easier than people think, though. I mean, you have to... It's like building blocks. So we're starting with... What you were starting with was a harmonic function. But that shouldn't sound scary. It's do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. Everybody knows the major scale. Everybody knows the rhyme that goes with that. Do is 1, re is 2, mi is 3, fa is 4.
And so on.
These are, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, octave, 8.
So
octave is the same as 1. So if you said major second, that would be the second degree. So if you're in C, that would be the note D. Also, you would call that a ninth. That's just up an octave. That's 2 up an octave. And 10th is 3 up an octave. An 11th is 4 up an octave. So sharp 11 is really a sharp 4, but up an octave.
Right.
And
so to reiterate here, so you've got the key of C. We'll start. That has no sharps or flats. That's just all like your regular notes. So a 1.
White keys on
so
the
piano. The 1 is a C, and then the 8 is the octave. It's just the C an octave higher. So same tone, but an octave higher. So that's your main framework for most music. And then
that's how the harmonic music gets. The terminology gets built up from there. So and then there's minor, major degrees based on that. So when you're teaching somebody a harmonic progression, and you say 2 minor, that's D minor. 3 minor, E minor. 4, go to the 4, that's F major. Go to the 5. That's 5 dominant. G7.
Right. And then
And G7 is different from G major 7 or C major 7. G7 has the F natural in it, so its 7th degree is flatted. And that causes a tritone. In G7, the tritone would be B and F. And that tritone is the sort of engine that moves the Western harmony. The dominant chords have to be resolved to tonic chords. So the G7, the inner tritone of B and F, is the devil's interval and needs to be resolved at all costs back to C major. That's what drives all classical music, let's say.
So to get back to kind of the basic building blocks of popular music, let's say bluegrass, folk, rock, blues, the main chords you use are the 1, the 4, and the 5. So when you hear us talk about that structure, and then what jazz kind of does is it then expands upon those 3 basic chords that 90% of all songs are written with, and they start adding in the 3 minor, the 2 minor.
Right. Well, so like folk music and the sort of the people's music sticks to 1, 4, 5. There's a few other chords that they do, but they kind of start sticking to those basic chords as their building blocks. But right away in regular traditional pop songwriting, which is what they call like standards now, what they call Broadway standards. Now, those songs use all the degrees in the writing.
Yeah, they're very, very sophisticated, complicated songs.
Well, yeah. Well, at least they're diatonically sophisticated. The music's still relatively diatonic.
Yeah.
In that, and the harmony's all relatively functional, and it can all be explained in terms of harmonic function. A place like Berklee College of Music spends all their time talking about harmonic function, and no time talking about harmonic resonances. So, and that's because of the jazz tradition coming out of the Broadway music. Now, the earlier, for lack of a better term, Dixieland jazz, that uses, again, traditional harmonic functions, very diatonic, 1, 2 minor, 3 minor, 4 major, 5, 7, 6 minor. Now, what bebop does is it superimposes onto these chords more exotic voicings that are then put into the soloist's line. So the saxophone player, Charlie Parker, would play in his linear conception the superimposed, more advanced resonant harmonies that Monk would be playing on piano, or Art Tatum. And so you're modernizing and updating and bringing in more modern sounds onto the functional harmony of the traditional music. Classical music's already doing that by the late 1800s, before it totally dispenses with all harmonic function and goes into complete polytonality and serial composition and more super advanced things. It just totally abandons its roots of harmonic function. But if you listen to early works of Stravinsky and Schoenberg and Bartók and Shostakovich and Debussy and all these guys, that music is still highly functional in that it's trying to attain exotic resonances through diatonic sounds. It still has function before it goes off into totally abandoning it to a more modern conception, like modern art or something. Modern art versus bowls of fruit, right?
Right. Now, one a phrase or a word you use a lot in talking about kind of the development of this jazz language, or as you're saying, classical too, is the word resonance.
Yeah, that's my thing. It's something that I'm really working on, and I'm developing.
Can you explain that simply and quickly, because we need to get to our.
I would love to.
Or is it?
I would love to.
Is it another conversation for another day? Maybe it's another.
Well, no, I mean you can always edit it out, right? So, in my studies, since I study 10 hours a day my whole life, I sometimes do process of elimination of what other people are forgetting to teach or forgetting to focus on in the music. And a glaring thing that I noticed from Bach to Mozart to Beethoven to Brahms to Mahler to Wagner to Debussy to Bird to Monk. I mean, the whole shebango is that they all have perfect pitch and they're all doing resonant chords on the piano. It's not just a C7-9, it's a C7-9 voiced like this. And when you voice it the way Art Tatum voices it, or use the grace note that Monk uses in there, you hear, if you really just stop and listen, you hear almost like a magical aural rainbow spectrum coming out of the piano. Sometimes it thuds, sometimes it sounds like a tornado coming out of there, like vortices coming out of the piano. Sometimes you hear overtones coming back off the ceiling, coming back down to you. Sometimes Monk's in control of this so intensely, he's making overtones ring that aren't on the piano. They're overtones off the piano. How does he do it? It's like a magic trick. And I realized that so much of the music that I love spends really a lot of time on that. Not harmonic function as much as these rich resonances, and it seems to like go from resonant event to resonant event, and almost as if they're showing you what their ears can hear. They're like Prometheus bringing down these glorious resonant tones from the gods to share with humanity.
Wow.
Totally misunderstood. It's amazing.
Cool. So I guess, part of Virtuosity, and as we go through a lot of music on these podcasts, is to try to train our ears to hear some of those little secret things that are kind of happening in the music. And that's something that before talking with you, I didn't know anything about any of that. I'd never heard of that.
It's so pervasive because once again, the composers and arrangers and great soloists and stuff, a good 90% of them have absolute pitch, and people with absolute pitch kind of, I think, gravitate towards these sounds, and it ends up being like, all your favorite arranging, when it sounds really fat and luscious, behind Nat King Cole or a Neil Hefti arrangement or a Billy Strayhorn arrangement, and it sounds like, wow, that is just big and juicy. How do they do that? That is resonant chord arranging. And if you look at how the chords are stacked and which instruments are playing which tones, they're totally controlling this resonant event. And that's what they're doing.
Cool. All right. So that's our jazz lesson for the day.
Okay.
No, that's
now we're
great.
going back to some simple bass playing.
Yeah, now let's go.
Bass playing.
Let's get into some
Way
guys
back.
going thump, 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 thump on the bass.
Yeah, I know. But these guys are really my main guys.
Yeah. So let's get into it now. We've got 12 cuts, so we've got a lot to get through here today. We'll see time-wise if we break this into 2 shows or not. Hopefully we can keep it all contained into one great show. And so, part of my deal here is I kind of gather together little bios on each of these guys. You know a lot of the information. Sometimes I come upon a few things you don't know about these guys.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a pleasure.
But my impression as I went through, and this speaks to some kind of stereotypical cliches or something that I bought into or something, is that kind of in the early days of these musical forms, whether it's bluegrass or blues or jazz, you really get a sense that the pioneers of this music were really kind of learning from other musicians in a very kind of natural way, that they weren't like studying in school or anything, right? They're inventing this music. It's coming very organically. And as I went through this list, what I started noticing, and we're talking about guys that were born kind of, around the turn of the century or just after the turn of the century, all had classical training, formal training in high schools, in attending colleges, and we're talking about some very sophisticated musicians who aren't just kind of picking it up from the older guy in the band. It's happening too, obviously, but I was impressed with how many of these guys have really had serious formal musical training, would start on the violin often, before moving to bass, and so that was a little bit of a surprise for me. But it makes sense that coming out of slavery, coming into the new opportunities, that there was opportunities now for blacks to go to school, and a lot of them obviously eager to take advantage of what that offered, and so that was impressive.
Well, there's a couple of turn of the century schools that the guys would go to that are kind of legendary, where a good percentage of the entire history of jazz musicians, and black jazz musicians in particular, come out of. There's obviously the New Orleans school, and that might be a little bit more of a local cultural thing, but everybody's doing it, and everybody's people are going to school. They're Creole. They're not just like they're not just for taking out the garbage. These people are going to have salons, and they speak French, and there's an attempt at social advancement in the Jim Crow South, and there's other schools like the famous guy in Kansas City, and there's the DuSalle School in Chicago. I mean, half the jazz musicians went to that school in Chicago with that teacher, and there's and so there's this, and Lester Young's dad taught a bunch of guys.
Right.
He would use it for his sort of minstrel show, like one of those camp shows that would tour around down south. So all of Lester Young's early experiences are that. But that guy taught everybody, Ben Webster, and et cetera, et cetera. So there's certain schools that the guys come up through. Like in St. Louis, everybody played trumpet in St. Louis. Miles says that St. Louis was this trumpet town, whereas Kansas City was a saxophone town,
Right.
And so the guys are teaching each other, especially the next generation of the bebop guys, the legendary stories, Everybody's practicing all day long in their hotel room. They're probably all freaking high and just sitting around, but they're all practicing and trying to advance the music harmonically. You have Freddie Webster and Fats Navarro and Bird and Dizzy Gillespie, and they're showing all the next generation white and black, how to play. Not just off the records. They're getting off the records too, but they're literally showing you in their hotel room while they hang out all day, and then they go to their gig at night.
Right. Well, yeah. So another just note in looking at these early guys, and we'll get into this as we go through the playlist, but the bass lines of these original Dixieland and New Orleans bands and stuff were all played by the tuba and not the bass. Yeah. And then a lot of these early bass players started off, like I said, studying violin or cello, and then playing tuba. And sometimes, like you said, trumpet or other brass instruments, before they end up with at the bass. And I guess the bass started to develop in popularity, and also recording techniques and things, began to develop later, that made the instrument easier to hear.
The tuba started to present itself as a somewhat limited instrument. It's a little bit lugubrious to get around, and the bass had a little bit more kind of sophistication to it.
Mm-hmm.
And then when the guy started playing in four, that's when the music really shifted, and there was a harmonic sophistication that the tuba could kind of lacked. But the tuba had the necessary volume, because a string bass without an amplifier, with a large band, you're not going to hear it. You're not going to hear it over the drums. You're not going to hear a string bass. So the guys had to
big horn section.
Yeah, the guys had to adapt a technique where they're kind of snapping the bass and slapping and snapping it and pulling on the strings. Gut strings. These are all gut strings. Nobody was playing metal strings till 1970.
Mm-hmm.
And that's an important thing for bass players to know, is that all your favorite jazz is played on gut strings. Period. Full stop.
Wow. Okay.
You're not going to make it swing and sound right on metal strings. It's just not going to happen.
Okay, so let's get into the music, and our first cut is going to be from George Pops Foster.
That's right, the founder. Everybody starts with him.
Now, when I was kind of checking him out, he came kind of from a musical family in New Orleans. He was born on a plantation in Louisiana, and he started on cello, and then later switched to string bass. And it says about 1907, he was working with King Oliver and other prominent bands in that era, and playing in St. Louis.
He was playing tuba in that band, right?
If you say so, yeah, maybe so.
I think so. Yeah.
And then played in bands in St. Louis, Los Angeles in the 20s, and said he got his nickname Pops because in some of these bands he was kind of older already than a lot of the other younger players in the bands.
Yeah.
And then in 29, he moved to New York City and got a gig with a guy named Louis Armstrong, whom he played with for over 10 years. And then also Sidney Bechet, Art Hodes, and had an incredible career.
I mean, that's just foundation, right? He's in Earl Hines' band, also a New Orleans guy.
Yeah.
You know? I mean, so he's playing with all the foundation. Sidney Bechet, that's foundation. Louis Armstrong, of course. And King Oliver, Art Hodes, this is where the music starts. And he's the bass player.
Cool. So we're going to listen to a song off an album called George Pops Foster with Art Hodes. Is that the right pronunciation, Art Hodes? And
I hope so.
and it's a tune called Mahogany Hall Stomp.